The last 400 years of world history has been marked by Great Divergence, the historical term used to define the great power imbalance between Europe and the rest of the world. Many non-European nations perished, many were colonized, the others scrambled to catch up to Europe. But there was only a single nation that managed to close the gap fast enough: Japan. In 1853, Japan was an isolated island nation. Within just 25 years, the nation was completely uprooted and it was on its way to becoming a global great power. For the Eastern nations at the time, Japan was an inspirational success story. But how did that come about? How come Japan succeeded while all others failed? Let's dive into it. But before we start the video, I highly recommend watching my video explaining why the Chinese, the Turks and the Persians failed to industrialize, as it will provide more context to Japan's success. One of the greatest problems with industrialization the non-European nations faced was that they simply didn't have the foundations to support their industrialization. Their governments were outdated and incapable of exerting enough control. Their populations were heavily agrarian and illiterate. And on top of everything, from 1700s on, they were faced with constant European aggression that hindered their efforts at every turn. By the time non-European nations realized what was going on, European gunboats were already at their gates. A lot of these conditions simply did not apply to Japan. After the Sengoku period, which saw dozens of small feudal daimyos fight each other, Tokugawa shogunate had managed to unite Japan under a single central regime. Under Tokugawa shogunate, Japan spent 2.5 centuries in peaceful isolation. The Japanese population skyrocketed, and perhaps just as importantly, the feudal structure was greatly weakened. The daimyo were disarmed, limited to a single fortress, and were forced to spend part of the year in the capital. As a result, the political and economic power shifted from rural areas to new urban ones that were developed around new daimyo domains. This led to the rapid urbanization of Japan. In 1800, 50 years before Japan was opened to global trade by American gunboats, Japan was more urbanized than countries like Spain and Portugal, and almost as urbanized as Italy. This urban economic environment, with its bustling domestic trade, mercantile class, and financial markets, would become a critical component of the Japanese industrialization. On top of urbanization, literacy rates were also extremely high. In 1800, Japan had a literacy rate of 30%, which was much higher than China, Russia, and comparable to countries like France and Italy. This was another key demographic advantage Japan had. Unlike China or the Ottomans, Japan did not need to educate its workforce to design or operate machinery, at least not to the same degree. Combined with the high urbanization rate, Japan had all the demographic components needed to fuel its modernization. But demographics wasn't everything. Political structures were just as important, especially in leading a massive nationwide modernization effort. Industrialization solely led by social factors at a natural pace could still happen, but it would take a lot of time. And one thing that 19th century non-Europeans lacked was time. As European great powers scrambled to paint the map with their color, industrialization had to happen fast. Japan had another great advantage in terms of its political structure. Despite its seemingly feudal regime, Japan actually had a much more centralized government than China, the Ottomans, and especially Persia. In 1800s, Tokugawa shogunate was generating 3 times more tax revenue per capita than China. It is estimated that Qing government budget was around 2% of the Chinese GDP. Meanwhile, Tokugawa shogunate's share in Japanese economy was 15%. When these two countries started their industrialization processes, the Japanese government simply had much more resources available to it than the Chinese one. This was somewhat due to the geographical and ethnic diversity of the two nations. Qing China was a massive empire that spanned across deserts, mountains, jungles, and arid steppes. It was ruled by a foreigner Manchu elite and was composed of dozens of ethnicities. Meanwhile, Japan was a comparatively small island nation that was largely monocultural. It was much easier for the Japanese government to control Japan. This meant that a moderated Japanese government had the political and financial resources to oversee industrialization. Ottoman and Chinese governments had to take crippling debts to finance their modernization. Meanwhile, Japan could achieve its goals largely with its own resources. By 1853, when Perry expedition had forcefully opened Japan to European shipping, Japan was already ready to industrialize. It had a highly literate population concentrated in urban areas and a decently centralized government. On one hand, this proves an arguably disappointing fact that there was no easy fix for industrialization. Japan had industrialized simply because it had developed the necessary social and political institutions over the centuries, and the others had not. But this underestimates the amount of luck Japan had during its initial industrialization process. From 1853 to 1877, the end of Satsuma Rebellion, a European intervention could have easily sabotaged the industrialization of Japan, fractured its government, plunged it into crippling debt, and sent it into the graveyard of empires. After all, it was a Russian invasion that had crushed the Persian Revolution in 1905, and it was the British that put an end to the promising Egyptian industrialization in late 19th century. The first component of Japan's luck was that it had an extremely lucky geography. Just like Britain, it was an island nation that was separated from the mainland. This kept it safe from invasions, but also Japan was close enough to the continent to benefit from trade with the mainland. From a 19th century European's perspective, Japan didn't offer much. It didn't have natural resources, and it did not have a massive market like China. And unlike India, it was united under a single regime that was perfectly capable of defending itself. Any expedition to Japan would be extremely costly, but at the end would not offer much reward, especially compared to China. So Japan was largely ignored, while the European efforts were concentrated on richer and weaker targets. But that wasn't everything. Japan also got extremely lucky in terms of the political background while it went through its modernization. In 1853, there were 4 great powers that could pose a threat to Japan: Britain, France, the USA, and Russia. Out of the 4 great powers of the Pacific, Russia and the US were still establishing themselves in the area. Meanwhile, Britain and France were largely concerned with China and Indochina. The very same year Japan was open to trade, Crimean War plunged Russia, Britain, and France into a bloody conflict. The war lasted for 3 years and crippled Russia. Shortly after, the American Civil War ended the American machinations in East Asia for a considerable amount of time. Thus, when Japan had its civil wars in 1868 and 1877, Russia and the United States were not in a position to interfere. Meanwhile, the French and British were largely distracted somewhere else. And before they knew, Japan was already a great power in the making. As is usually the case with great successes, Meiji Japan was equipped with the right tools and was at the right place at the right time. So Japan industrialized. Meanwhile, other Asian states had to endure another century of humiliation. Thank you for watching. If you have liked it, please subscribe and leave a like. And I will see you in the next one.